Good morning, HASP. As people continue to find their seats, I have a few announcements. First of all, I'm Sharon Nelson Arnsource, the president of HASP, and I welcome you to this sunny March monthly program. We're so glad to see the sunshine, aren't we? Okay. A few reminders this morning. First of all, if you've not already done so, please mute or turn off your cell phones. You may have noticed there was an announcement that came out to you that the bus wasn't running today. We will have the bus available next month. Today we did not have a driver. That's why that was not available for today. I'd like to let you know that I am not soliciting gift cards. Have some of you received an email supposedly from me? Please do not buy gift cards and send them to someone somewhere. There is no fundraising going on right now in HASP, and if there would be one, it would come through official channels. Do not send me any gift cards. Thank you. I only take cash. Okay. One other reminder is that the HASP review, those articles and the things you'd like to submit are due by the end of this month, and your never before published artistic work that can include poems, articles, memoirs, fiction, photographs, pieces of art that can be photographed for publication, all those are welcome by Ralph Fairbanks to put in the HASP review. You may email them to Ralph or drop them off in the office. Now, there's one other thing I want to do today, and that is an active participation visual definition. Are you ready? Active participation visual definition. My question for you all is, what does it mean to be a peer-led organization? HASP members are active in HASP by participating in classes, by attending monthly program, by volunteering in Hope classrooms and participating in other special service projects, and that's the heart of our learning organization. But participation is not the same thing as being peer-led. So HASP is really fortunate to have two competent, hard-working staff members in Ian and Amy. They support and help run our organization, and they do so much for us, but they don't do it alone. Without HASP members' work and leadership, there would not be a HASP. And what does it mean to be peer-led? I want to show you. Here's the demonstration part. So, if you, during this past year, have done any of the things I name or participated in HASP in any of these ways, please stand and remain standing, okay? You can do it. If you are a current board member, please stand. If you're a standing committee member, that would be curriculum, communications, monthly programs, service, special events, or membership, please stand. If you're a curriculum subcommittee member, humanities, fine arts, social sciences, or science, medicine, and technology, please stand. If you've taught a class during summer 2022, fall 2022, or are teaching sometime in this term, winter, spring 2023, stand. If you're not already standing and have been a class coordinator in any one of those terms, stand. If you volunteer as a tech volunteer or in the office or library, please stand. Look at all these folks. And not everyone is here today. Some are joining us online, some are not in town. This is what makes HASP work. One more thing. If you have ever served in any one of those capacities, please stand. Whoa! Thank you all. HASP would not be HASP without you. So if you've not yet had an opportunity to stand for HASP leadership, please let me or Amy or Ian know what area you might be interested in serving in, what might appeal to you. In the surveys, people said, if asked, I will serve. If asked, I will lead a class. If asked. Now I'm asking you to tell us where you'd like to serve. We need your gifts and your skills. Currently, curriculum committee and the subcommittees are working on course proposals for summer and fall, and they need teachers. On July 1 of every year, some of the members of each committee fulfill their terms of service and new members join. And the chairpersons of all those committees are in the process right now of looking for new members. So if there's some way you'd like to get involved, we really would encourage you to let us know. And we're always looking for tech volunteers and office volunteers as well. So what does it mean to be peer-led? You've seen it in action as you've participated in HASP programs, and this morning you've seen some of the folks who make it all happen. HASP is not HASP without both your participation and your willingness to serve in a leadership role in this peer-led organization. So I look forward to continuing to lead with you. Now, Membership Chair Doug Walford. That's not mine. Oh, here it is.
We are delighted to welcome and introduce 6 new members and 2 reinstated members this morning. And I'm going to ask you to stand when I read your name so that your fellow HASP members can appropriately greet and welcome and recognize you. I realize some of our new members may be with us online this morning. Anyway, new members this morning include Kathy Benedict, Charlotte Nealis, Joan Sanders, Mike Short, John Canfield, and Sandy Slager. Reinstated members are Jim Brown and Nancy Clark. So we're just delighted that you're with us, have come join HASP, and please join me in giving them a HASP welcome. We all have friends, we all know people who would really enjoy HASP, get a lot out of what HASP has to offer. So please, I encourage you to talk to them, tell them about HASP, and even better, invite them to a monthly meeting like this and encourage them to join us as well. So thank you.
Good morning, scholars of HASP. It is my pleasure to introduce my name is Gary Bogle, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today who will be chatting about reimagining American schools. But first, let me ask a question. What are some of the common connections that schools or education and architecture have? Let's see, students go to school in buildings that are traditionally designed by architects, and there'll always be a need for laboratory spaces, spaces for creative arts, athletic spaces, and these are generally also designed by architects, not by athletes. Architecture touches our lives in every day, and it's an art form that really cannot be avoided. And to quote Churchill, "There's no doubt whatsoever about the influence of architecture and structure upon human character and action. We make our buildings, and afterwards, they make us. They regulate the courses of our lives. And consider the vast amount of time our students, our children spend in school buildings. And so those buildings do regulate the course of our children's lives. So there's a great deal in common in education and architecture. Today's speaker is leading a national initiative to bring together leaders from education, technology, design, and civic community to rethink public education and the building of American schools. Our speaker has his feet solidly planted both in education and design. In education, he was president of the Oklahoma City Board of Education for a decade. In architecture, he was the president and CEO for 16 years of the American Architectural Foundation in Washington, D.C. He was the president of AAF. He launched Design for Learning, and with funding from the Gates Foundation, worked directly with school districts across the country to examine how the learning environment can be reimagined to support improved education. He's an honorary member of American Institute of Architects. As a result of his work in education and design, our speaker today was invited during the Obama administration to be a speaker at the White House Summit on Next Generation High Schools. The most important thing for me today, though, is that I have the honor and the privilege to introduce my brother, Ronald Bogle.
Good morning. A point of distinction, Gary. Thanks for that kind and generous introduction. Most of it was true, which is always a good thing, but a point of distinction is that I'm his younger brother. So those of you who know Gary know him to be a friendly guy. Donna says he's never met a stranger. And what you might not know is that he spent, along with Donna, 30 years of his career teaching in Europe. And so as a younger brother, I'm going to emphasize that throughout this morning's presentation. I had the great fortune of visiting Gary and Donna in Europe frequently, actually. And one of my first trips to Italy, where they lived, I was impressed that they had made themselves so much a part of the community. We went out to run errands one afternoon, and we stopped by the wine shop. And the wine's, "Oh, Signor Bogle, good to see you. Oh, your money's not good here. Here, take this. It's my best wine." We went to the fishmonger. The monger said, "Oh, Gary, how are you? Here, take this fish." I thought, this is wonderful. They've made such a great home, and everybody seems to know Gary. That's great. So we took a weekend trip to Rome. There we are, in front of the Vatican in that great plaza. And Gary says, "Stay right here. I'm going to go into the Vatican. In about 15 minutes, I'm going to come out of that balcony, and I'm going to be standing with the Pope." Well, if you know Gary, you know he's a prankster. I said, "Sure, right. You may know the fishmonger. Maybe you know the wine merchant, but you don't know the Pope." So I thought, okay, he's just going to grab some guy. They're going to stand out on the balcony, wave, and then... So he said, "No, just ask any of these Italians standing around. They will know that that's the Pope." So sure enough, he comes out on the balcony. It's quite a ways away. He's standing next to a man in a white gown, big pointy hat. I can't tell who it is, so I grab this Italian, and I say, "Come here. Who's that up on the balcony?" And he says, "Well, I don't know who the guy in white is, but the other guy, that's Gary Bogle." I'd rather make this more of a chat than a lecture or a speech, partly because I'm going to mess up frequently, and it makes it easier if I just characterize it as a talk. But I do want to talk to you about a subject that maybe you don't think a lot about, but we all should be thinking about. But I'd like to know who you are a little bit first. Just by a show of hands, I won't ask you to stand. How many educators are there in the room? Oh my goodness. Well, let's narrow that down a little bit. How many K-12 educators in the room? My goodness, how many college, university educators? So a lot of K-12 educators in the room. How many architects in the room? That's a relief. How many technology experts in the room? Technology teachers, technology professors, computer specialists. That's also a relief. I saw a partial hand go up. I don't know what that means, sir, but maybe you should explain yourself. I said, "How many technologists?" And he went, "You're not going to? Okay, that's fine. I don't want to put you on the spot." So today we're going to talk about the history of public education a little bit, and you think, well, what does that have to do with the design of the learning environment? Well, you'll see it has everything to do with how we design our schools. So I'm going to give a little bit of quick history on the history of public education, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what the vision for the future of education might be and how schools begin to evolve to support new ways of teaching and new ways of learning. A point that I'll make is that, classrooms and buildings don't educate students, but they can either lift up and support the teacher or the educators, or it can undermine and provide obstacles for learning and teaching. And so that's why it's an important part of the education story that often is not included in our conversations. So let's get things going. So I am Ron Bogle. I am president and founder of an organization called the National Design Alliance. Our principal program is called Reimagine America's Schools. I want to make sure this is working. It is. We're a nonprofit. We work with cities, schools, mayors, and other leaders when it comes time for them to think about building schools. And it happens more often than you might imagine. And we bring our teams to communities as a service in support of better outcomes for the community itself and better outcomes for learning in the school. The question is, how did we get from this to this? From this to this? What's the pathway that we followed in our nation to really essentially revolutionize the whole institution of learning from the simple one-room schoolhouse? And we all know, even though we may not have gone to a one-room schoolhouse, we kind of know what went on there. They were hyper-local. They had one teacher who taught all subjects. Generally, it was like first grade through eighth grade was the span of the educational period. All students were in one room together. The young kids sat up front. The older kids sat in the back. They went to school far less than we go today. And only about 5% in the 1890s, only about 5% of the students would study beyond their experience at the one-room schoolhouse. It was an agricultural-driven economy. A lot of the students, well, a lot of the young people, were then working in the fields, and that was kind of the life. Well, actually, the one-room schoolhouse still existed as far into the 20th century as the 1950s. And maybe there's still one or two hiding around someplace. But it was generally replaced by a new concept of public education. In 1982, the public education world began to change. It was largely due to this man. If you're an educator, maybe you've heard of Horace Mann, who's generally considered to be the father of public education. Horace loved to travel the world, and he visited Prussia. And he came away from his visit to Prussia saying, this is the model for American public education. And some of the defining characteristics were that, think about that one-room schoolhouse where one teacher, one age cohort essentially in the same room from first grade to eighth, but the students were divided by age, by ability, and by subject. This was a new idea. In Prussia, public education was compulsory, but it was also free. And it was also a place where Prussian culture was taught to young people. They were socialized on what it is to become Prussian. So he comes back to the United States with this idea, and he finds some eager listeners in these individuals, the captains of industry, who were trying to figure out how do we get a more reliable workforce in our industry and workplace. We have all these kids that have been farming. We need to get them geared to become different kinds of workers. And so they really loved Mann's ideas that he brought back from Prussia. And it was the Roosevelts, the Mellons, the Carnegies, and apparently Ebenezer Scrooge. I don't know how he got in there. So we need a blue ribbon committee that's going to help us take the Prussian model and mold it for our United States of America. So a committee was appointed, and it was a very original name. There were 10 members. It was called the Committee of 10. There's one member of this committee in particular that could be of interest to you in Michigan, James B. Engel, who was the longest-serving president of the University of Michigan from 1871 to 1909. So through James Engel, Michigan influenced the very shape of the future of American public education. So here's what the Committee of 10 was tasked to do. In 1892, they were asked to create a standardized curriculum for American high schools. Secondary education, keep in mind, really didn't exist at this point. For the most part, it did a little bit in the private world, especially in New England. But really across the country, the idea of going to school until you're 18 was a new idea. So they developed a series of recommendations that you will recognize. 1892, they suggested 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, and so forth, all the way down to electives, art, vocational subjects, and for the future Gary Bogle, music. Otherwise, he would not have had a career. And so we're so happy the Committee of 10 included music. But this became the aspiration for American education, that every student would go through this rigorous program of subjects. And this is where it begins to diverge from the idea of the local one-room schoolhouse and begins to start looking like that big mega school that we saw earlier in the presentation. Because now they needed to come up with an organizational device of how do you structure the day so that these students will have each of these subjects and so on. So the organizational device we're also extremely familiar with, because I would guess that most of us went through this in our own education. So here's the device that was created. You create a space where there are hallways and classrooms, and a specific group of students goes to a specific class at a specific time to hear a specific message. They sit there for 45 minutes or an hour, the bell rings, they get up, they move into the hall, they go into another specific space to hear a specific message at a specific time. This became the way we organized secondary education in America. And from the 1890s forward, every school that was built around this model. So now think about the typical American high school. It's built so that it structurally supports this organizational device. Classrooms, hallways, lockers, the whole mechanism is geared to that. And as long as that's the way we're teaching, that's perfectly fine. In the 1890s, that was fine, and maybe in the 1920s it was fine, in the 1940s it was fine. But our culture begins to change, and the needs of our population begin to change. And so now, slowly but surely, education is taking on different approaches to teaching and learning. And a classroom in 1892, however, looks a lot like a classroom in 2023. So while other building types in our life have changed over that period of time, if you were to pluck somebody up from 1892 and drop them in our culture and take them to a hospital, they would be awed and amazed. What is this magical place with all the lights and the sounds or drop them in a modern shopping area? My goodness, look at all the abundance of goods you have here. Put them in a car. Give them your phone. Oh, phone, I forgot to set my timer. Hold on. Pause for a 30-second break. Talk among yourselves. So I'm supposed to be finished by 10:25. Sorry, and that means I have 30 minutes. Oh, that's plenty of time. So take that person, take them to your home. Look at the size of the closets and the indoor toilets. Are you kidding me? You drop them in a classroom, and they're going to go, oh, this is a classroom. Now, the whiteboards are not the same, but pretty much everything is the same. So here sits this building model that we call a school that's basically, it might be prettier now than it was in the 1920s, although we built some spectacularly beautiful schools in the early part of the last century. But essentially, it is structurally identical to the original concept of schools. So why don't schools change? It's a good question. But I'm not sure we should care. Why should we care? I mean, we're all out of school, and we've gone on to do other things. Is it important? I mean, they were fine for me. Why wouldn't they be fine for the current generation? I have a few reasons why we should care. First of all, it's the most public of all public buildings. I don't know that this is absolutely true, but I suspect it might be, that it is the most common public experience to Americans that they have had some meaningful engagement with a public school. Grandchildren, children, you went there yourself. So that's important because it's an integral part of our culture. Just the building itself being nestled in the neighborhood. Every day during the school year, approximately 25% of Americans enter into a school building. Students, teachers, principals, staff, but parents dropping off the kids, tutors, mentors, and others. About 1 in 4 Americans visit a school. About 95% of us went to public schools, spent a huge amount of our life in those environments. And the traditional neighborhood school is ubiquitous. There are over 110,000 K through 12 school buildings in the United States. These are kind of compelling, but here's something that's even more compelling. This is how much money we spend on school construction. There's not maintenance. It's modernization, new construction, renovation, every year. That seems like a lot of money. Where does that come from? It's almost all local. You've probably done it here in Holland, I'm sure, where a bond issue or some kind of a tax initiative is presented to the public votes on it, yes, let's build a new high school, and off they go to the races. That's where this $50 billion comes from. It comes in small buckets of, well, pretty big buckets, but of millions of here and millions there and millions there, until we get one of the most substantial amount of monies spent on public education, but it's basically an invisible investment. Generally speaking, there's no effort to leverage these investments. You know, we leverage every nickel spent on technology and every nickel spent on training and education. But this pile of money is generally not included when we think about how do we improve, elevate, increase student achievement in our schools. So we're going to talk about that now going forward a little bit, because this is kind of what we end up with when we build a new school, some version of this. $50 million, $100 million is spent on a new building, hallways and classrooms, even though maybe the teachers are talking more and more about project-based learning or one-on-one or hands-on stuff like Maker or STEM, but we still build the same building. So it's the issue of form follows function. As the function begins to shift within our schools, the reason we need to reimagine schools is because the shape of the school needs to support the new functions. So it's not this. This is the classic teacher in front of the classroom, students in a row. But the future of school looks a lot like this. There are 10, 11, 12 different ways that students might work together with educators during the school day. So that's where we're headed in terms of a vision for the future of reimagining America's schools. So I want to say again, I'm not advocating that schools are teachers, although they are not neutral. This space is a great example. If we were in a dimly lit, beat-up old auditorium that used to be a movie theater and was kind of, the seats weren't comfortable and the room temperature wasn't good, it would change our experience in this space. So space is not a neutral player. It either supports our objectives or it undermines our objectives. And the same is true about teachers and educators. It either supports or gets in the way of what they're doing. So I have a question. We know what schools look like or looked like, and I'm advocating that maybe we need to think about some new ways of thinking about what schools look like. But what would that be? I'm curious, how many of you have become familiar with ChatGPT? Show of hands. Okay, so ChatGPT is, as you know, and the others will learn quickly because it's coming on us like a tsunami. It's artificial intelligence. It's an open chat bot where we can engage with artificial intelligence and ask it things. And I did that. So, by the way, we're making history today. I believe this is probably the first speech you've heard that was co-written by artificial intelligence. Probably won't be a footnote in the history book, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So ChatGPT is an artificial intelligence. You can read it with over 1.6 billion words at its access in order for it to draw from the content that it derives. And it's not an algorithm like Google. It's actually not a thinking device, but it's an intelligent interface where it's actually researching the question that you're asking in real time. So I said to ChatGPT, what might schools look like in 21-23? It's very formal. As an AI language model, I don't have personal views or beliefs, but I can predict based on current trends and advancements. So I'll just skim through this a little bit. Schools in 21-23 will be more student-centered, more individualized learning plans, project-based learning. Teachers may be more like facilitators and mentors rather than just lecturers. Technology, virtual and augmented reality. And this next point, I think there's a little bit of a conflict of interest here. You see if you agree. AI-powered educational tools. Of course, they're promoting AI. But it's true that AI will become a dominant force in how we think about the future of educating our young people. Personalized learning experiences, flexible and adaptable learning spaces, various learning styles, more interactive, collaborative, more dynamic, furniture can be moved. Students will learn beyond the classroom by using technology with online courses and remote learning opportunities. In conclusion, 21-23 will focus on personalized learning, interactive learning, integration of technology, and so forth. And it's only appropriate for this audience that I now say, thank you, Hal. Okay, so design. Design is not an independent, standalone engagement. It is a reaction to and an engagement with. And if we're going to think about the future of our learning environments, it has to be architects, technologists, educators working together, thinking together collaboratively. And the problem is if we don't think collaboratively, bad things can happen. For example, the guy that put down the sidewalk and the guy that built the fence should have talked to each other before they did their thing. My brother and sister-in-law are bicycle riders, perhaps some of you are. The guy who laid down the bike path and the guy who put up the should have coordinated because it's going to be hard to get over that. Think about passing period in a major high school and the owners of those 4 interior lockers. It's not quite going to work for them. So part of what's being suggested here is we have to think about the human experience when we think about design. It's not some abstract idea. You really have to think about how are people going to use this. For example, I don't know what they were thinking here. Maybe it's a combination bank and fitness center. I don't know. Now, the good thing about this is that these seats are half price. I have no idea what's going on here. You look at this picture, I thought it was like a 1920s penitentiary. But when you look a little closer, that's a low-flow toilet. This is from a high school that was built in 2020. So it looks like an unpleasant human experience, if I may say. Now, here's the good news about this. Between 3:15 and 9:45, you are good to go. So these are some things we don't want to repeat as we think about the future of education. But the good news is that we have architects and educators that are spending their whole careers thinking about what the next generation of schools looks like. Fielding International is a very well-known architecture firm. They have, among offices in Minneapolis and overseas, they have a big office in Detroit. They have developed, by kind of collating all of the ideas that are being generated by architects around new ways of thinking about the design of schools, they have put together a study that has 70 different design patterns that are currently beginning to emerge as topical trends in thinking about how we design schools differently. They put together a beautiful video for us, but it was a little bit long, but mostly I just had technical problems getting it into the program here, so I just grabbed some screenshots for you. But one or two of the models of the patterns, I should say, as they're thinking about, when we think about the traditionally built school, it has really 2 or 3 basic spaces: classroom, hallway, cafeteria, auditorium are kind of then you've got the shop classes, which were a variation of the classroom. But most educators and architects now say that there are 10 or 12 different learning modalities, and that we ought to accommodate that in the design of our schools. And so here's an example of a learning space that is more of a personal space. It's more of a quiet space where you can either do study by yourself, or you can be engaged one-on-one with your teacher or fellow students. But it's a pattern now that's beginning to emerge. And when I show you examples in the 17 minutes we have remaining, you'll see what those look like. And I'm going to blip through these a little bit more quickly. Another pattern is, how do you take a 2,000 student high school and make it feel more intimate, make it feel less like the masses? So this idea of learning communities or learning neighborhoods is another model or pattern that's emerging. You'll see examples of that a little later in the presentation. And these learning neighborhoods also aren't just classrooms with doors, but they can be reconfigured in a number of ways. And by the way, a learning community would typically be like 4 learning rooms, classrooms, if you will, 4 teachers, 20, 25 students in each. So you have 4 teachers and 80 students that really typically would just spend the day together. And they would move around within that space rather than one student engaged with 2,000 other students. It's a more intimate kind of space. Instead of just traditional doors, maybe it has garage doors so you can open up a room. It has a variety of different ways you can actually literally reconfigure the space, reconfigure the furniture. Learning walls. Instead of just having plain walls, turn your walls into learning opportunities. So they can be places to put artwork, they can be places to display your science projects. You can see here they even have a climbing wall. Fielding International is building a gigantic school in Asia, and they talked about that as a place where they're really introducing many of these design patterns, studios, flexible studios, small group rooms, cave space. and how those spaces can be configured, reconfigured. And here's kind of what one looks like in real life. Lots of transparency so you can see between and among the spaces. Calming retreat, there's a little kid by himself in the middle of the room, and so forth. So this certainly feels different than a traditional learning environment, but because it's more intimate, the teachers have more eyes on, so it's also an easier place to kind of monitor safety, security, and activity during the learning day. Now we'll move into some real-life examples of projects that I and my team, me and my team, I and my team, which is it, Amy? I and my team? Me and my team, okay. I'm in front of a bunch of educators, I don't want to get it wrong. Have worked on, as Gary mentioned, I was at the American Architectural Foundation, so we've been working with schools for over 20 years. And here's a school that we worked with back in the early 2001, 2002 period. I won't read this word for word, but design never starts with drawing. It starts with what are you trying to achieve? What are the guiding principles that you want to have happen in this space? What can you do in this space that you can't currently do with the space you have available? So they talked about, these are words now that begin to be familiar. They talked about the collaborative learning environment and inventive learning settings, meaningful community partners, culture of empowerment. Those don't sound like design discussions, but that's what guided the design of this school in conservative Casper, Wyoming. I'm going to catch up with myself here. So the Pathways Innovation Center is a state-of-the-art education facility located in Casper, as I said. It was designed to provide school students, high school students, with hands-on, project-based learning with a variety of fields, technology, science, engineering, math, so largely a STEM school. It certainly looks expensive, and I asked the architect when I interviewed him for this, and he said, no, it cost the same as every school in Casper, but it just looks different. This looks, Donna, like one of the buildings we saw in Holland the other day that cantilevers out over the... So it is an innovation center. It's a non-traditional high school for students who want, a more intensive learning opportunity. So now you begin to see in practice some of the design ideas that our artificial intelligence came up with and that Fielding International talks about. Informal learning spaces, studio spaces where you can have either private time or work in small groups, lots of transparency, overlooking spaces, and here's one of their art studios. But if you look, it's surrounded by this beautiful natural landscape, and the architects were very particular about making sure that the landscape was a part of the environment for them, not closed off to them. That's a part of a health and a wellness aspect of designing the learning environment. This, by the way, is the agriculture lab. Their science lab is really quite remarkable because it doesn't look like any science lab you've ever seen. They don't have a physics room or a chemistry room or a biology room. This takes place all in this environment. And the apparatus up above, they can pull down. That's where they get their gas, their utilities, their water, and all the other things you need in a science lab. So when it's not operating as a science lab, it also can operate in a variety of other ways. So this creates a much more flexible space than if you were bound by fixed casework and other kinds of built-in equipment and furniture that we normally see in laboratory classrooms. Again, more informal space, but the rooms over to the left can open up into a singular classroom or can be closed into 3 separate meeting spaces. The other thing you'll notice about this, that students want to be in environments that are more like the kinds of space that they'll be in when they go to work. Schools don't look like workplace. So the idea now is that we're trying to kind of create work environments for students and teachers that here's their cafe, which is run by the students, and they have a culinary arts program. Another pattern that's emerging more and more in schools is called the learning stairs. Maybe you've seen them. This is very common now, and in many ways is beginning to take the place of an auditorium. Because an auditorium is kind of a single-use space, but this, you can hang out on it with your friends, or you can plug your laptop in because there are electrical outlets at each riser. It also is where they do their TED Talks. It's where they have their assemblies. And in this instance, they have a small one and a large one. Again, more open space. This looks over kind of the industrial lab that they have a fully functioning kind of mechanics program for students there. So this is operating within a budget, but totally thinking differently about how the space will support this unique program. Had they put this program in a traditionally built school, it wouldn't have worked. So the Natrona School is an example of how schools in the future might look. Here's a second project that we worked on in New York City called School of One. It probably has gotten more media attention than any educational program I've ever known. We worked with the designers of school, not designers, but the educators. It is back in 2009, 8, 7, in that time frame. It is a middle school pullout program. So the students come in from their traditional classroom, and it's a 2-hour math block that the students come to. And the person who designed or created School of One came to us and said, this is an educational program that will not go into a regular classroom. I know it will fail. If it does, help me invent a new learning space. So we worked actually through a series of rapid innovations and iterations. We worked with Joel Rose and his education team for over 5 years to refine and define the School of One. And in 2009, Time magazine selected it as one of 50 best ideas of the year. Now, how many math programs does that happen with? Not too many, probably. But the idea is that it is rethinking the education space. And I mentioned 10, 12 different learning modalities. The educators at School of One have actually identified 12 different learning modalities, and they've asked us to help them design what the space should look like to support those different learning styles. So it could be one-on-one, it could be small group, it could be a kid just with his computer. And they have realized that every student has a different way of learning, as the educators in the room know. So these different learning modalities are created so that students can experience the learning engagements that are best suited for them. And so the solution was actually sublime and simple. We go into a high school, we knock down 2 walls, and we end up with space that is the equivalent of 3 classrooms. And then within that space, we create these different learning activity centers. But how does a student know which learning center to go to? How do the teachers know? Well, the backbone of the School of One is an algorithm. By now, maybe it's artificial intelligence. And every morning, the student goes in and they check, it's like the airport. They go in and they check the screen, where do I go today? Because after school on the day before, the teachers worked with the algorithm to say, well, little Johnny's falling behind on mathematics. He does better in game learning. So the algorithm will assign him, with the teacher's involvement, to a couple of hours of game learning the next day. So little Johnny or little Susie goes in and sees where their assignment is for the day. The algorithm doesn't take the place of the teacher. The teacher uses the algorithm as a tool to help them make decisions more rapidly on how students can achieve. This program has blown the ceiling off of math learning nationally. It was in New York, now I think it's in 10 states, 12 states, and educators are really gobbling this up. So design didn't make it happen, but it made it possible. Glover Middle School, Spokane, Washington, they passed a $600 million bond issue, and they were going to build 6 new, what they call junior high schools. For educators, we now don't call them junior high schools, we call them middle schools. But they had a very traditional view of what the junior high school should be. It's like a small high school, right? So we worked with Spokane over a period of months through a series of engagements involving students, involving principals, even involving me. And they came up with a metaphor of the stretched rubber band, that what we're trying to do is stretch the way we think. And you can see one of the students has this gigantic rubber band. And if you let go, it goes back to the way it used to be. So you always have to keep the pressure on that stretch so that you fulfill what your dream is. And they even came up with a model using a series of stretched rubber bands to kind of talk about what are their principles that are driving the design of their school. So they talk about community, connectivity, curiosity, etc. So the rubber band becomes their metaphor. How do we keep our ideas stretched and not go back to the way that we always did it? So then we went into our design charrettes, design workshops with the educators and the students, and they began to come up with the idea. They liked this idea of this sort of neighborhood community. And you can even see over here the early configurations of what a community cluster might look like, where the media is next to this room and it's next to that room. And then it gets translated into more formal analysis. They also live in an area that they really value the outdoors. So how can we kind of echo what's going on in our physical environment around us in the very school design? And then they come up with their school design. And Glover was the first of the 6 schools. And it's now, I would say, a word stronger than influencing, but it is influencing the other 5 schools dramatically in terms of how they design. You can see in the upper left, you see the gymnasium and some of the other common spaces. But around the lower portion, it doesn't look like a regular school because they've designed these clusters of 4 or 5, I'll say classrooms, I'll say learning spaces. And it is the model that we were talking about before, where maybe 80 students and 4 teachers, maybe it's 100 students and 5 teachers, work together during the day, and they work within that cluster of spaces. It's the same number of classrooms, but they're just configured differently so that we take a 2,000 student school and reduce it to an 80 or 100 student experience. Just going to move through this. This is Glover, more casual space. You've seen similar between Spokane, Washington, and Casper, Wyoming, some very similar themes emerging. I'm going to close to this afternoon, or is it morning? Morning, in the last 2 minutes with the work that we're doing today. So one of the issues that came up in our work during the pandemic was the vast inequities in education as it relates to brown and black students in poor schools, in underperforming schools, and in poor neighborhoods. And for any of us that were awake and paying attention during the last few years, it emerged as I would say, a serious concern that we need to address. So our question is, how can what we do address that issue? And months of dialogue with lots of different people, we came to the conclusion that in a poor neighborhood that's underserved, a poor school that's underfunded, under-resourced, and underperforming, it doesn't make sense just to go in and build school and leave the neighborhood as it is. At the same time, it doesn't make sense for the city to go in and lift up the neighborhood, but leave the school the way it is. So we developed a concept that we call education-centered community reinvestment, where you really address the school and the neighborhood as a singular ecosystem, and you look at how do you raise that entire neighborhood and school in a singular strategy. It's difficult because the way that we typically operate in our cities is school districts build schools, cities build roads and bridges and housing, and economic development authority invites industry or employment opportunities in. But what we're doing with Atlanta, and fortunately they are leaning into this with a lot of enthusiasm, is really treating the neighborhood and the school as a singular project. So we've had a series of workshops in Atlanta since last May. Our last was in Atlanta at the John Lewis School, in Atlanta, named after Congressman John Lewis. And I'm out of time, but I'm going to wrap it up. And really what we're doing there is, in the 1980s, Atlanta Housing Authority went in and literally scraped off 5 or 6 neighborhoods. It was poor housing, poor neighborhoods, in poor condition, and the authority said, well, we're going to scrape these off, and then we're going to build new. Well, they never did. So Atlanta has these vast areas in the outer ring of the city where there are streets, curbs, driveways, but it's like some dystopian movie where the trees have grown over and the vines have grown over. And the current mayor, who is an incredible visionary and a man that we'll be hearing from, Mayor Dickens, said, we're gonna fix this problem. This has been going on too long. Atlanta's supposed to double its population in the next 20 years. We want them to live in Atlanta, not out in the suburbs. So we're gonna rebuild these cities, these communities. But we want to rebuild them as whole communities, not houses, schools, roads. So working with us working with him, he has created a new platform for city government where he's brought the schools, Housing Authority, the Economic Development Authority, the city, the mayor's office, all together to work toward this strategy. So since May, we've been hosting creative kind of think tank workshops. Well, what is, in our area, by the way, is the Hollowell Corridor, which is in the upper left hand. And that's the pilot for this whole program. It's the beta test. Can we do this? Because this is not typically how cities work. So we've been doing Reimagining convening since last May. Discovery workshops, ideation workshops, application workshops, engaging principals and teachers and students and community leaders to really begin to imagine, what would this look like? If we could do this, what would it look like? And there's a level of enthusiasm that's really building, because usually if you do these things, it's a one-day workshop and then you go away and nobody ever hears anything. So we've been back every month and they're going, oh my God, how many times are you coming back? But the process demonstrates the commitment. And so we are about 3/4 of the way through with our work. We have some exciting new visions that have been generated by the people who are going to be driving those changes. And I'm excited to report to you today that this is a model that is taking the work we've been doing for decades and expanding it in ways that I'm really excited about, because it may provide a pathway forward for other cities that are trying to struggle and deal with these same challenges and issues in their cities. Thank you for the opportunity to go over this with you today, and thank you for being so polite and just sitting there and listening. Nobody screamed at me or threw things, so thank you. You need to know. As Gary said, I was on the school board for 10 years in Oklahoma City, and it wasn't always this nice, so thank you very much. So I think that we're supposed to have discussion, so I'm happy to open it up, and I guess people are going to be going around with microphones. And I guess I would just start out with the ground rules. There are no dumb questions, but there might be some kind of dumb answers. I don't know. We'll see. Yes?
You've talked about structure of buildings and function of learning. And I think that in America, we have multiple advanced degrees with people that are practically inept. That's not criticism, it's observation. I think our education system is compartmentalized and it's theoretical. And for example, we're taught the names of certain tools didactically or theoretically, but not really shown or apprenticed in how to use those tools. For example, if you take geometry, we can learn enough to pass tests and have it, and then go through the rest of our life not being able to do something simple like transferring that memory of the theoretical and how to use it on how big is that tree in my backyard, or how tall is that building, or other practical uses. Another example might be English. We can get critiqued by teachers about the content of how we've written English, but yet we aren't apprenticed, and here's 4 different ways to write the same thing. Which one is more effective? Now let's try to, here's some examples, now let's write them and then critique which one was best and why. Well, how can we introduce that into the American education system where it becomes useful, not didactic in degrees, and we're practically inept?
So one of the things that I should have pointed out early on is that I'm not an educator. I was president of the school board, but that only makes me really kind of an observer. And I'm not an architect. So I've just learned a lot from others. But I think one of the things that we don't do in our work, we can't fix American public education. I think others are going to have to do that. We can respond to support change when we see it, but we're not the agent that's going to be addressing some of those fundamental kinds of questions. I'd be happy if anyone else might have a thought to respond to the gentleman's observation and question, but it's just not I mean, I hear what you're saying, and in the design of space, if I'm hearing your question right, we do that. We say, let's not just be arbitrary and build a space. Let's collect data on this. Is it actually better? Is it working? Is it achieving the objectives? But a lot of the data we collect is more serious anecdotal data, and not, it's really hard to draw a straight line between the design of a classroom and student learning. But it can be a part of a conversation that supports that. But that's just above my pay grade, your topic. So a warning to the rest of you, if you ask me education questions, Yes. Yes.
This is really exciting to me. I wonder,
If you're speaking to it.
okay. Exciting to me. I wonder what schools in Michigan or close to Holland maybe are trying to really get into this, and is there any school we can see right now that's practicing at least part of what you're talking about?
I think one of the things that, I can't cite specific schools, but I do know that in Holland, for example, one of the things that you're doing here is creating a very sort of intentional outdoor space for learning. And that's one of those patterns that we talked about earlier, is how do we use outdoor as rather than just as a playground, which has a certain kind of intentionality and purpose, and it's important. But how do you design outdoor space so that it's a more active part of the learning experience? So I do know that. I do know that some of our architect friends in Detroit and elsewhere in the state are experiencing a receptive audience in terms of the changes that they are seeking in their schools. But I can't speak specifically to any schools that I know of here. I started out with the Michigan one-room schoolhouse, but that's not really what you're looking for. So. Yes?
My question is, how do you incorporate the new security systems into these school systems?
Yeah, security. So security is an important and an essential question, and the design of the school certainly has a role in that, but it's a larger issue than just the design of the school. And so there are social issues and legal issues and other kinds of things that we are all intimately and fully aware of if you have TV and read the paper. But I think there are things you can do in schools short of turning them into minimum security prisons, which some communities believe is the solution. And there are other issues that on the surface seem logical, like, well, let's just have one entrance to that school. But functionally, think about the human experience, you just can't do that. You can't squeeze 2,000 kids through a door. So there are design solutions that are being integrated, use of certain kinds of glass in some cases that provide protection. But I think that, and I'm thinking of one school we were part of in Oklahoma City, the John Rex Academy, where they actually have a kind of a holding area in the beginning, in the front, and during the day you can open it up so that students can get in easily, but there are ways to kind of narrow down the entrance during the school day. So there is active thinking about this. The American Institute of Architects has a committee called the Committee on Education, and they're doing serious research on what is the role of the design of space, so we still achieve all the things that you saw in the examples, the transparency, the openness, the flexibility, but you're also mindful of the need to have security. But ultimately, there's a larger question in your question that we're going to have to work across many, many areas of our country to solve. Yeah.
I understand that money drives everything in America, but let's put that aside. And instead of building a building that houses 2,000 students,
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder, wouldn't it be better to build smaller neighborhood schools and get back
Yeah.
to the neighborhood community concept, which kind of looks like what Atlanta might be thinking about?
Yes.
Can you speak to that? To me, it just seems better to have smaller, personal learning spaces instead of a huge 2,000. That just really turns me off to think
Yeah.
of 2,000 kids in
Yeah.
a building.
So over a period of about 40 years, we began to build consolidated schools further and further out to the edge of community. And any of us could talk about how that's undermined. Part of the role of school has been it's been, if you think of a circus tent, it's been one of the tent poles in neighborhoods. You know, it's been one of the go-to places. It's where I went to school and where my kids went to school and where their kids go to school. And so there's something in our culture that really likes that more hyper-local approach, and I agree with that. But the problem is, you build a high school in 1970 on 40 acres on the edge of town, it's going to be there until about 2040. So you can't undo that. And so what you can do is say, well, going forward, let's think more about the school in the neighborhood. The other issue there is school districts don't think about neighborhood and community development. They think about, where can I put the school? So in Atlanta, by merging the city and the schools together, they think about not just where can I put the school, but how can the school become an integrated part of this neighborhood? So there's another driver here that is there are racial issues, because many communities are segregated by race by living patterns, and when you do the neighborhood school, you kind of create a more reinforced segregated environment. And you know, back in the 70s, we tried to fix that with the finger plan, and Oklahoma and the Supreme Court, said we got to segregate our schools, and that was decades of churning within our school systems. So it's still an existing problem in our schools today, and that's the other side of the coin on the local school, is that it does kind of raise that specter up again, as how do we deal with that. But I totally get the idea of being an elementary school child and being able to walk to school is such a desirable thing for families. So,
Ron, a comment and a question. That was wonderful, by the way. Inspirational and optimistic of what our future educational systems should be and can be. So what you're doing with Reimagine is fantastic. My question is, are there any measurements or metrics that are going on from what has been accomplished that will help feed what should be in the future, so others will be able to see the results of that and it will affect the educational system across the board?
So I think that's an essential question. We don't want to just go because it feels good or maybe that'll work. You want to have data. You want to have something that gives you a reason to make decisions. Frankly, school boards are judged harshly, and they need some underlying content that helps support why they make certain decisions. An example in my presentation was the School of One is intensely data-driven, and they can provide, because, well, their entire program is integrated into technology, so they're just collecting data constantly. But School of One, they're now called, I've forgotten what they're called now, but School of One has an enormous amount of data support, and it also helps them inform their decision-making on a day-to-day basis. So, and in an era where we have the technology to do that, then there's really no excuse for not having data to understand whether program A works better than program B, or this strategy works better than that strategy. So yes, I think that that's essential, especially if you're changing the norm. If you're saying, we can keep building the schools the way we always have, it's fine. But if you start saying, no, we need to do it differently, well, tell me why. Show me the data that supports that decision making.
I know we have, this will be our last question. I'll let that question go because we have a time element. So, sir.
In your opinion, have athletic facilities become an unwieldy percentage of education dollars spent, or have they become an important part of the culture of the school and community system?
Well, I'm glad we're ending on a non-controversial question. So in Oklahoma, I used to say, there's good news and bad news about Oklahoma and Texas, actually. Let's see, what is it? No, now I've got this joke and I can't remember how it goes. Oh, here it is. In Oklahoma, the bad news is that 75% of our superintendents are former football coaches. The good news is it used to be 95%. So, you know, how do you separate culture from culture? I mean, sports is an important part of our culture, in some areas of the country more so than others. I mean, my personal opinion is the education dollar should always go first to education, but who's to say that learning on the sports field is not a part of an education? But as long as they do a better job than that one picture with the seats facing the brick wall, no, I mean, certainly there should be a balance, but you know, you go to places, and I'll pick on Texas. Are there any Texans here today? If there are, you may leave now. No, you go to places, communities in Texas, enormous dollars are spent on sports facilities, but, you know, the communities love it. I mean, in Oklahoma City, when we passed our $1 billion bond issue to rebuild every school in the district when I was president, we used the arts as the lead, not sports. We engaged parents to say every school should have an art studio, every school should have, and I'd never seen people more enthusiastic than sports parents, but the arts parents were even more enthusiastic. So, but I don't know how to answer that except to say it's a reality of our culture that people love sports, and they're going to spend money on sports facilities as a part of expression of their love of sports. Thank you all again very much. I really appreciate being able to be here.
Ron, thank you very much. Thank you for making us aware of how important the facility is within which we learn and from in which our children learn. So there is a wonderful connection between the architecture and the facility. Appreciate your sense of humor. Wonderful. And appreciate the fact that you came and were able to speak to us. Will you stay after if people just can come up and ask you individual questions if they didn't?
No, I'm not another speech in Zealand. I have to rush off.
You have to rush off? I don't know. Does he have time, Gary?
Of course I'll hang out.
Gary says you have time. And since Gary is
Thanks,
your
Gary.
older brother.
Yeah, I know. On one condition. Is there any coffee out there?
Yes,
Oh,
I'm
good.
sure there is.
Thanks
yeah.
again.
Maybe we'll get you a cup. Thank you. I want to remind you all next month, we will be hearing from Lindsay Olson. Lindsay does art and ocean. She's a textile artist. And for those of you who were members of HASP in 2020, March of 2020, Lindsay was our last live speaker before we were shut down for the pandemic. So we thought it was only fitting that she come back and share with us the work she's been doing. Thank you and have a wonderful day.